Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. On November 5th, 2024, the US citizens will elect their next president. The election in US has raised considerable excitement among Indian audience as well. And hence, IGPP has begun an educational series to introduce the audience to the various facets of the electoral procedure in the US and reflect upon the various issues that are important to the American voters, which in turn would acquaint the audience with the social and cultural complexities of the nation. The program would further reflect upon the consequences of the voters' choice upon the larger world with particular focus on India, and highlight the role played by the Indian and other diaspora communities in the US elections. The party conventions are one of the most important events in the US political calendar, where the parties officially nominate their candidates for the presidency and vice presidency. This process involves delegates from each state and territory casting their votes, typically based on the outcomes of the primaries and caucuses held earlier in the year. Beyond the nomination process, the convention serves as a crucial platform for party leaders to articulate their policy positions, set the tone for the upcoming general election, and unify the party behind a common agenda. It is an opportunity for the party to present a cohesive message to the nation, aiming to rally support not only from its base, but also from undecided voters and those who may be leaning towards the opposing party. The tradition of political convention in the United States dates back to the early 19th century. Before the era of political conventions, presidential candidates were often selected by congressional caucuses, small elite gatherings of party leaders. This process was criticized as undemocratic and out of touch with the broader electorate, leading to calls for a more open and participatory system. The first political convention in the US history was held by the Anti-Masonic Party in 1831, setting a precedent that was soon followed by other parties. Over the years, political conventions have evolved significantly. In their early days, conventions were often dramatic, contentious events with multiple ballots sometimes required to choose a nominee. Delegates engaged in intense negotiation, and the final outcome was often uncertain until the very end. One of the most famous conventions in US history was the 1924 Democratic National Convention, held in Chicago, which went through a record 103 ballots before finally selecting John W. Davis as the nominee. The significance of political convention extends beyond just the nomination process. They have been key moments in American political history where party platforms are established and future leaders are often introduced to the national stage. Conventions have also been moments of great drama and spectacle, with memorable speeches and historic moments leaving a lasting impact on the political landscape. Today, the outcome of the nomination process is usually known well before the convention takes place, with the primary and caucuses effectively deciding the nominees. As a result, conventions have become more about messaging and pageantry than about the actual selection of candidates. They are carefully choreographed events designed to present the party in the best possible light and to generate enthusiasm and momentum heading into the general election. The vice presidency is a critical aspect of the convention process and a significant decision for any presidential nominee. As the second highest executive office and first in the line of succession, the vice president's selection often involves strategic considerations such as balancing the ticket geographically, ideologically, or demographically. Historically, the vice president was the candidate with the second most electoral college votes, as specified by the original US Constitution. This system proved problematic, leading to the 12th Amendment in 1804, which established the joint ticket system for the president and vice president. In modern times, the vice presidential candidate is typically chosen by the presidential nominee, often with input from party leaders and advisors. This selection is usually announced before the convention, which serves as a formal introduction of the running mate to the public. Factors influencing the choice include the candidate's experience, compatibility with the presidential nominee, appeal to key voter demographics, and ability to help secure important swing states. The selection process is rooted in constitutional requirements and political strategy. According to Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, the vice president must be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and a resident of the United States for 14 years. Beyond these requirements, the process involves extensive vetting, including background checks and interviews, to ensure that the chosen candidate complements the presidential nominee and can effectively assume the presidency if necessary. Political maneuvering and vetting are integral to the process, with potential candidates evaluated on their public image, political track record, and ability to collaborate with the president. This decision is influenced by current political dynamics, public opinion, and party needs, with final approval typically involving consultations with key advisors and party leaders. Though rare, a vice president can be replaced during a presidential term. The 25th Amendment provides the procedure for filling a vacant vice presidential office. The president nominates a new vice president who must be confirmed by a majority in both houses of Congress. This process highlights the importance of maintaining a stable and effective executive branch. In the context of 2024 presidential election, J.D. Vance's selection as the Republican vice presidential pick is a strategic move aimed at strengthening the campaign's appeal to working class voters, particularly in economically struggling regions like the Rust Belt. Vance, a U.S. Senator from Ohio and author of the best-selling memoir Hillbilly Elegy, has a strong connection with blue-collar Americans who often feel overlooked by traditional politics. His populist rhetoric, focus on economic revitalization, and a personal history of rising from poverty resonates with voters in key swing states such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Vance's selection is designed to energize a critical voter base, align with the campaign's message of economic opportunity, and address the economic concerns of Middle America. His conservative stance on social issues also has the potential to unite various factions within the party, making him a pivotal figure in what could be a tight election. On the other hand, Tim Walz, the vice presidential pick of the Democratic nominee Kamala Harris, has had a distinguished career marked by his commitment to public service. Serving 24 years in the Army National Guard, where he achieved the rank of Command Sergeant Major, Walz later transitioned to education as a high school teacher in Minnesota. His political career began in 2006 when he was elected to represent Minnesota's 1st congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. In 2018, he was elected governor of Minnesota. His pragmatic leadership and handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, along with his efforts to unite rural and urban voters, bolstered his reputation as a bipartisan leader. These qualities, combined with his appeal to working class voters, made him a strategic choice as the Democratic vice presidential pick, aiming to balance the ticket and attract Midwestern voters concerned with issues like healthcare and education. The 2024 Democratic National Convention and Republican National Convention stand as a testament to the enduring importance of political conventions in American democracy. The Democratic Party convention was held on August 19 to 22, while the Republican National Convention was held on July 15 to 18 this year. While the process and presentation have evolved over the years, the conventions remain a crucial moment for the parties to solidify their vision and present a united front to the nation, rally its supporters, reach out to undecided voters, and set the stage for the pivotal months ahead. At IGPP Expert Talks, we have been discussing various issues that are shaping the US elections. And as the Democratic National Convention draws to a close, let's take this opportunity to dig a little deeper into the history of party conventions and talk about the vice presidential picks of the nominees. To discuss the past and present of the conventions, today we are joined by Professor David Goldfield. Professor Goldfield is the Robert Lee Bailey Professor of History at the University of North Carolina. He is the author-editor of 16 books, including Cotton Field and Skyscrapers, Black, White, and Southern, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in History. His most recent published books are America Aflame, How the Civil War Created a Nation, Still Fighting the Civil War, and The Gifted Generation, When Government Was Good. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you.
So by the time we release this conversation, the Democratic Party convention would have concluded, and Kamala Harris and Tim Walz secured their official nomination. But what are these party convention? And we don't have such processes in India. So please do shed a little light on what these party conventions are. How did they come about? And what is the significance they hold to the whole electoral process?
The first party conventions were held in 1832. So there's almost a 200-year tradition of holding these party conventions. And the U.S. Has always been a diverse country. And the idea behind the party conventions was that we could get people together to come to a decision on who would be the best candidate, not for a particular state, but for the entire country. And Andrew Jackson, who was the Democratic Party candidate in 1832, believed in opening the political process to a broader segment of the population, not only party leaders in each state, but people who were interested in politics, but not necessarily politicians. And he opened up the convention, starting the convention as a means to incorporate and energize the party base by including individuals who were not professional politicians. And that tradition began in 1832 and has continued until the present day.
We do understand that through the conventions, like the state delegates come and put their vote, and new leaders, vice presidential picks are introduced to the nation. And in the Republican National Convention, which was held in July, we saw that Donald Trump announced his running mate, J.D. Vance. And though the vice presidential pick for Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, had been announced before the DNC was held in August, we saw that through the convention, there were certain themes through which it seemed that they were trying to outline their vision or, solidify their agenda for the election. So I want to ask you that when such themes or such visions are outlined, is it the presidential nominee's vision? Is it the presidential nominee and the running mate's vision? Or is it the party as a whole's vision?
It's the party's vision. These decisions are made by committee. Now, obviously, the presidential candidate has considerable weight in determining what direction the party is going to go in on particular issues. But the nominee has advisors. The nominee also has colleagues in the House of Representatives and in the U.S. Senate and in other key positions in and outside the government that they listen to. And the idea here is to get elected and to have a program, a platform that will not only encourage voting, but encourage a broad swath of the American people to vote for your candidate.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the way conventions are being held and the sort of pageantry that has become like an important part of the convention, where there are artists, where it's just more than a political event. It's a fun fair. It's sort of pop culture coming together with politics. Do you think it sort of diverts the audience from what is like the true agenda that the parties should be talking about? Or do you think, I mean, it's culture, it's a carnival, it's fine?
We have two major political parties. And because we have only two major political parties, these parties are diverse, particularly the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party I grew up in was a party that consisted of Southern white segregationist Democrats and Roman Catholic and Jewish voters from the North. Now, you can imagine that diversity. The purpose of conventions is to take all of these diverse groups, bring them together, and have a party. And not only have a party, but also nominate the next president of the United States, who would be a consensus candidate. That is, he or she would appeal to the broad portion, not only of the party, but of American voters.
Do you agree with the sort of woke agenda, or like as they say it on Twitter and pop media, that the Democratic Party seem to have adopted, or in other words, the sort of liberal ideas, liberal ideology that, I mean, is it a natural evolution of the party that you see, that you think it is? Or what is your view regarding it?
The Democratic Party has, since the 1930s and the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, has been the party that believes that the federal government can do a great deal for American people. They have taken Abraham Lincoln's words that the role of the government is to do for the people what the people cannot do for themselves. And Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but the Democratic Party adopted that saying as their way of governance. The Republican Party historically has not followed that dictum. They believe more in the value of private enterprise. They believe that government regulation should be limited. This was a philosophy particularly promoted by Ronald Reagan, who became president in 1980. And he said at the time that the problem in America is not the people, it's the federal government. It's just too darn big and gets into the lives of people. So we're going to reduce the federal government. These distinctions have not held over the past 40, 50 years, because during the Donald Trump presidency, the federal government was quite active in areas that were not active. They were not active before. So it's become a little less of a division between the two parties as far as the role of the federal government is concerned. But generally speaking, the Democrats want an active federal government for the welfare of Americans, and the Republicans want a limited federal government so that individuals can reach their full potential without interference from the government.
I want to talk to you about the vice presidents that have been picked up as running mates. What is the role of vice president in the government structure? And we know that the running mate heads the Senate and is expected to take over the presidency if the need arises. But we also know that it was the case that historically the presidential candidate who received the second highest electoral votes would become the vice president. So, how has that role evolved over the years? What is the vice president supposed to do in the current structure of government as it is?
It was very confusing at first because in 1800, the Thomas Jefferson received the most votes, and second, John Adams, the incumbent president, received the second highest votes. And they didn't like each other. And in fact, they represented two different political parties. Now, when the Constitution was framed, there were no such thing as political parties. So yeah, the person who gets the highest vote becomes president. The person who gets the second highest vote becomes vice president. But as it evolved with the party system, it made it very awkward. So by 1804, we had the 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which said, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to have a ticket with the president and vice president of one particular party and the president and vice president of the other political party. Now, in terms of what the vice president does, usually the vice president is selected to draw in voters from a particular constituency, either a geography or an income level or an ethnicity. But to be perfectly honest with you, the vice presidential pick is irrelevant, because the vast majority of Americans, when they go into that voting booth, they're voting for a president. We had a saying in Memphis that you were a yellow dog Democrat. Well, if a yellow dog ran as vice president, we'd still vote for the Democratic Party in Memphis for the president, a real live person. So it really does not matter that much. The vice president does not draw in the votes. Now, sometimes it helps, but that's very rare. In 1960, John F. Kennedy selected Lyndon B. Johnson as vice president. The reason being is that John F. Kennedy was from Massachusetts. And if you are from the South, as I am, you're not too sure about folks up in New England, up north. And plus the fact that the idea was that we were in the middle of a civil rights revolution. And if you were in the South and you were white, you weren't quite sure what John F. Kennedy thought about it. Plus the fact he was a Roman Catholic. And here in the South, historically, Roman Catholics have had difficulty. So Lyndon Johnson was placed on the ticket to tell Southern white voters, hey, we're okay we're not going to create any problems for you. Well, of course, as history showed, Lyndon B. Johnson became the civil rights president after John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Do you think that a similar scenario has unfolded itself with the choice of Tim Walz as the vice presidential pick for Kamala Harris? Because we do understand that when it came to Donald Trump, there was little or not much enthusiasm about how what the vice presidential pick would be, how it can help him, because his agenda or he seemed to be like a one-man party himself, right? But in the case of Kamala Harris, there was a lot of speculation, and there were reports that it has to be a white male, right, to appeal to maybe sort of undecided voters who are not Republican, who may be Republican, but like sort of don't support Donald Trump's parties, or those undecided voters. So I just want you to shed a little light on the present scenario and tell us what political considerations do you think have gone into the choice of J.D. Vance and Tim Walz as the vice presidential picks of their respective nominees? And do you think it would have electoral ramification?
The idea of selecting a vice president, as I mentioned earlier, the vice president really doesn't have a significant impact. That historically, there may be one or two elections over the past 200 years where the vice president has meant something. The vice presidential candidate has meant something. In terms of J.D. Vance, Trump's idea was twofold. First of all, Vance comes from Ohio, and Ohio is a key state in terms of the electoral college. But over the past 3 or 4 elections, Ohio has gone Republican, and it is really a red state, red being Republican, blue being the Democrat. So the politics were not as important as the visual. Don't forget, Donald Trump is a TV personality, and he wanted someone who would reflect a positivity about the ticket, a youthful positivity. And of course, Donald Trump is older. He's in his late 70s. And J.D. Vance is of a different generation. But at the same time, Donald Trump did not want someone to overshadow him because he is the most important person on the ticket. So that these considerations went into the selection of J.D. Vance. Now, as far as Tim Walz is concerned, his politics are pretty similar to the politics of Kamala Harris. So it wasn't so much the politics in selecting Tim Walz, and you're absolutely right. He's a white man, and he's a former football coach, and we love football here in America. He's one of the guys, and you have a multiracial woman running for president. So to have one of the guys as vice president, that's important politically. If you look at his record in Minnesota, he's just as liberal, if not more so, than Kamala Harris.
The Democratic National Convention this time was held in Chicago, which we understand is a Democratic stronghold, and it also has a significant African American and Hispanic population. I want to use that location to ask a broader question about political divides along racial lines in US. Does race continue to dictate political preferences in the US? And why is that? Because a whole civil war happened to fight against the idea of slavery and for equality, and yet it continues to like evoke emotions and then responses. And especially with the candidature of Kamala Harris, the race question seems to have become really important.
Here in the South, we're still fighting the Civil War, even though it ended 150, 160 years ago. So it's still very current. It's interesting because historically, Black voters, when they could vote, now in my home city of Memphis, Tennessee, we had a Democratic Party machine, and they allowed some Black citizens to vote. But you go 25, 30 miles south of Memphis into Mississippi, and maybe 1% of the total Black population in Mississippi who are eligible to vote. So there was disfranchisement, and there was disfranchisement because white Southerners who were Southern white Democrats associated Black people with the Republican Party because Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln ended slavery. Abraham Lincoln sent soldiers into the South to kill Southerners. So if you were in Memphis or in Mississippi or in any part of the South and you said you were a Republican, that was dangerous. That was dangerous. So historically, Black voters had voted Republican. That changed in the 1930s with the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Democrat. And I would say less him than his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who insisted that Roosevelt appoint Black people to federal offices because the federal government expanded significantly as a result of the Great Depression. We had to get America back on its economic feet again. And so the idea was, particularly for Eleanor Roosevelt, that if we can get Black people to vote for us, that will ensure that the New Deal, as it was called, and the legislation that followed would be implemented. And so from beginning in the 1930s, you had the switch of Black voters from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. In the 2020 presidential, like the last presidential election we had, over 90% of Black voters voted for Joe Biden, the Democratic Party candidate. And that was fairly typical in previous years as well. However, in this election, there has been some leakage, some movement of Black voters into the Republican camp for a couple of reasons. Reason number one was that Joe Biden promised a lot in 2020. And for some Black people, those promises were not kept. Or they were just addressed very briefly and then forgotten. The other thing is that the Democratic Party is very strong among women. And for some Black men, that is not a good thing. And the idea here is, and you can see it in the statistics, just to give, I don't want to throw numbers at you, but just to give you an example, in 2020, almost 16% of Black men voted for Donald Trump, the Republican candidate. Black women, that was 4%. So that's a pretty big electoral gap, and that gap has maintained. It also is maintained among white women as well. They about 56, 57% of white women voted for Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, in 2020, as opposed to 43% of white men. So this has been a trend not only for Black voters, but also for white voters as well, in terms of the gender split in the party. I mean, you look at the controversy over abortion, for example. This is going to be a big Democratic Party talking point, and it already has had a significant effect upon our politics. The 2022 off-year elections, midterm elections, typically the party in power loses a lot. It didn't happen in 2022, and one of the major reasons why it did not happen was the abortion issue helped the Democratic Party.
The US election has been a roller coaster ride up till now. But now candidates are decided, running mates chosen, and agendas more or less fixed. And though at the start, the Democratic Party had a rocky start, but it has emerged stronger and has surpassed all expectations. Do you think that this election will also, in many ways, set the course that the parties are expected to take in the coming years?
I think this is going to be a defining election, one way or the other. If Donald Trump and the Republican Party win the election, we're going to see a significant increase in executive power. The way the Constitution is set up, you have the executive, which is the president. You have the legislative, which is the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and you have the judiciary, which is the U.S. Supreme Court. And the idea behind the Constitution was that these three entities would have a balance of power. One wouldn't be greater than the other. They would all be equal. Well, in practice, that has not happened. And over the years, the executive powers have increased significantly. So I think in the Trump administration, you're going to, and he did this in his previous administration, you're going to see pushing this envelope, pushing to expand even more the executive power. In a Harris administration, what you're going to see and what she would hope to see would be a more active role of the federal government, harking back to Franklin D. Roosevelt and the idea that the federal government should do for the people what people individually cannot do for themselves.